Hello everyone, welcome to Social Psychology, Psychology 346, and today we're going to be talking about attitudes. Now, what are attitudes? Well, some would argue attitudes are the most important construct in social psychology. An attitude is just an evaluation of something, a positive evaluation or a negative evaluation. And we evaluate everything. Specifically, we evaluate attitude objects, but attitude objects can be pretty much anything. It can be people, they can be specific objects, stimuli, they can be situations or events. We evaluate how we feel about pretty much everything. So I might like Skittles, or I might like Justin Timberlake. Those are attitudes towards those attitude objects. Attitudes are slightly different from beliefs. So attitudes are evaluations of something, whereas beliefs are facts or opinions about the world. So I might have a positive attitude towards the TV show Heroes. So I say I like Heroes, but if I say that Heroes is a drama, that's a belief. That's more factual information. I might have a negative attitude towards bees, saying bees are terrible, but if I say bees are aggressive, that would be an opinion, that would be a belief. It doesn't really say whether or not I think aggressive is good or bad. It just is a way of describing bees. And attitudes can be complicated. We can have both positive and negative attitudes towards the same thing. I might think that Skittles are delicious and think positively towards them, but I know that they're unhealthy, and so that means I feel negatively towards them. Generally, when we have complicated attitudes about something, one of the two attitudes oftentimes wins out. And sometimes we can see what's known as ambivalence implication. That's when one of the two attitudes leads to behaviors or responses that are probably more intense than they otherwise would be because we have these ambivalent feelings. So we can have both positive and negative attitudes about an attitude object. And sometimes attitudes are easier to verbalize or think of than other times. So if we have a funny painting or a funny picture, we might be able to easily verbalize why we like something. Whereas if we have a piece of fine art, so for example, Starry Night by Van Gogh, we may know that we like it, but we might not necessarily be able to verbalize why we like it. And this kind of distinguishes nicely the idea between explicit and implicit attitudes. Explicit attitudes would be our ability to say why we like the funny picture. Easy to verbalize and control, relatively quick to form and change our explicit attitudes. And these attitudes often capture the complexity of attitudes. We're able to describe exactly why we like something and explain to others why we dislike something. Alternatively, we can have implicit attitudes. These are sometimes difficult to verbalize or control. These are slow to form and change. These oftentimes form due to associations between specific objects and positivity or associations between objects and negativity. And they generally capture the automaticity of attitudes. So we can look at an object, say an apple, we might be able to verbalize that we dislike the apple. That would be an explicit attitude. But our implicit attitude suggests that we might actually like the apple for some reason. These are harder to control. These are harder for us to explain why. We just know that we like the apple. We can't really for certain tell you why we like it, but we know that we do have this positive attitude. So how do we form these attitudes? Well, there are several different routes that we can take. Some focus on affect, some on cognition, some on behavior. The mere exposure effect is one of these routes that focuses on affect. So we generally develop more positive feelings about an object or about a stimulus the more that we encounter them or the more that we are exposed to them. So there may be a song on the radio that, if we really listen to the words, is probably pretty silly, but the more we hear it, the more we start to like it. And this often occurs with neutral stimuli or objects that we don't already have strong attitudes about. The more we encounter it, the more we might like it. This is kind of how advertising works. The idea is to bombard you with this product over and over again, and the more you see it, the higher chances are that you're going to like it and then subsequently purchase it. We can also build up these effective attitudes or effectively driven attitudes through conditioning. Again, as I mentioned, building up the associations between specific objects or specific people and positivity, or specific objects and negativity. And we can also build up associations between two different objects. So, for example, the Little Albert studies by Watson focused in on a small child being presented with a bunny, but at the same time they're also presented with a loud noise. So the child learns to associate this loud aversive noise with the bunny, and so every time they see the bunny or encounter the bunny, it's been associated with negativity, so they have a negative attitude towards the bunny. This idea of conditioning is often used again in advertising. We can think about associating positivity with products or sexiness with products, if we remember back to the fact that what is beautiful is good. So associating beauty with a product should then associate positivity with the product. And it's also one of the reasons why people trying to woo a client or woo a business often take them out on a fancy business dinner, trying to associate their company and their individuals in the company with classiness, with positivity, with nice dinners, etc. Attitudes also influence associated attitude objects. So I may have a negative attitude towards diet soda, for example, Diet Coke. And that means that because I don't like Diet Coke, I also don't like every other diet soda, even though I haven't directly interacted with those objects. So I can kind of use my attitudes about one object and kind of carry it over to other similar objects. This goes with other ideas. So I like the show Heroes, and therefore that means I like the actor Zachary Quinto. And because I like Heroes and Zachary Quinto, that means I'm probably also going to have positive attitudes towards the movie Star Trek, with which Zachary Quinto is in. Some of the cognitive ways that we can form attitudes, using a pros and cons list, so thinking about the specific reasons why we like or dislike a specific attitude object. Oftentimes we use this technique when we have attitude objects that we have both positive and negative attitudes towards. But more often than not, forming a pros and cons list simply does not work. We generally want to focus on implicit attitudes rather than explicit attitudes. The pros and cons list is focusing on trying to figure out, all right, what are the reasons I can verbalize about why I like this? But in reality, our true attitudes about an object are driven by the ones that we can't verbalize, our implicit attitudes. And lastly, we can focus on our behaviors to form attitudes. So if we remember back to self-perception theory, the idea that we can kind of get a better idea of who we are and maybe how we feel about ourselves or how we feel about other objects by observing our own behaviors, kind of taking a step back and watching what we do. If we remember the Long Bridge, the misattribution of arousal study, people in that study were trying to observe their behaviors to figure out what kind of attitude they had towards the experimenter. They noticed that they were aroused, they are having physiological responses, so they used their behaviors to form an attitude that they must have positive attitude towards the experimenter. And as I mentioned, a lot of people would argue that attitudes are the most important construct in psychology. They help us think about ourselves and others. They help us figure out what we do and don't like. They help us decide what to do for a living, who to interact with, who to date, and whether or not to discriminate against another person. So attitudes are really an extremely powerful driving influence on everything that we think about and do. And not only do attitudes give us knowledge about ourselves or how we should behave, but it also helps us decide who we should associate with. If we have specific attitudes about donuts, for example, we're probably going to gravitate towards other people who have similar attitudes. I like Heroes, I want to gravitate towards people who also like Heroes. So I'm kind of figuring out who I am, my own identity, and using my attitudes that I know of to find similar and like-minded people. So that's all we have today. Thank you for your time and attention. I will see you all next time. Bye.